This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
A second West African regional bloc delegation heads to Guinea a day after ECOWAS imposed sanctions on the military junta. Chinese President Xi Jinping rallies the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to help Afghanistan achieve peace. And the threat of U.S. sanctions looms large for those perpetrating the conflict in northern Ethiopia. Hello and a very warm welcome to you wherever you're joining us to Africa Live only on CGTN. I'm Mahia Mutua in Nairobi. Ramanyang joins me now with your business headlines.
That's right, Mahia. Here's what's coming up in the course of the hour. Ghana signed a $1.2 billion deal to develop bauxite resources, building a mine and a refinery. And Kenya's maize harvest is forecast to drop by 30% due to poor rainfall. We'll have the details on those stories and plenty more coming your way in the course of the hour. For now, let's start with the latest in current affairs with Mahia.
Rama, thank you. Now, a second ECOWAS delegation has made its way to Guinea. It's being led by the presidents of Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. ECOWAS has called for a short transition period of 6 months. It's also pushing for the release of Alpha Condé. This visit comes after the regional bloc announced new sanctions on Guinea's military junta. The delegation is expected to meet with the military leaders. Over the past several days, the junta, led by Lieutenant Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya, has been holding talks on the formation of a transitional government. Well, for more on this, we're now joined by Paul Melly, a consulting fellow at the Africa program at Chatham House. He joins us via Zoom from London. Paul, is the West African regional bloc likely to help restore constitutional order in Guinea using the sanctions approach?
I think the question that whether Guinea will get back to constitutional order is it's fairly certain. Of course, nothing is absolutely guaranteed, but almost certainly Guinea will move back to constitutional elected government in the relatively short term. And the sanctions are really designed to apply personal pressure on the members of the military junta to achieve two goals. One, to press them to stick to the agenda that's agreed, because ECOWAS is very worried about the transition in Mali, where there was a second coup during the course of the transition. And so there's a lot of concern as to whether the military who staged the coup there will stick to their original promises. So they want to avoid a repeat of that in Guinea. At the same time, they also want to put pressure on the junta to say, if you staged a coup in the name of reform and restoring democracy, claiming that the old government had gone off track, then you have to stick to it. You have to stay out of the elections. This can't be about your personal interests or your personal power. So that's where the sanctions are for. The room for compromise probably comes over the timetable, because already people around the government in Guinea are saying that 6 months may be too tight, because the electoral roll needs to be updated and revised, and to have a really credible election, especially in a country where the elections last year under President Alpha Condé were certainly not very credible, and there was a lot of concern about the voters' roll. That could take more than 6 months to get that nailed down, to get the electoral roll completely revised and full arrangements in place. But ECOWAS wants to set a very firm tone here.
So what should ECOWAS do then to effectively implement the changes that it wants to see then in Guinea?
Well, I think the approach they're taking is probably the right one. They've made this absolutely top priority, and they've moved very fast. And the two presidents who have arrived in Guinea today are two of the most respected and experienced in the regions. Alassane Ouattara, president of Côte d'Ivoire, which is a neighbor to Guinea, and Nana Akufo-Addo, the president of Ghana. So this sends a strong message that the region is united, and they are coming on behalf of the whole bloc. There's no dissension. The whole of ECOWAS is committed to this procedure. They haven't just nominated an envoy. They've actually come, two of the leading presidents, in person to nail this down. But there are challenges, but the challenges are probably over the wider question of credibility of ECOWAS, because there are a lot of people in West Africa who are saying ECOWAS is a president's club. It's becoming too comfortable in defending governments when they're in office, even if they abuse their own constitutions or breach human rights. And it only really bangs the table when there's an unconstitutional change of power. So that's going to be a tough issue for the future. But for the Guinea situation in the immediate short term, probably the ECOWAS stance is the right one. But much will also depend on the attitude of Guinea's politicians, leading people like the former Prime Minister Sidia Touré and Cellou Dalein Diallo. If they back these terms, that will give them added clout. If they, on the other hand, sympathize with some of the questions that the military junta may raise, then ECOWAS might have to soften its line a bit.
And finally, Paul, is there then a sense of double play here, double standards at play here, given the fact that ECOWAS usually adopts a stance of non-interference with internal members of its members?
Well, ECOWAS doesn't really have a stance of non-interference. The ECOWAS policy as it stands is that soldiers cannot take power permanently by military coup, and that unconstitutional changes, whether it's a coup or any other form of unconstitutional change, must be quickly reversed. But as I mentioned before, there is an element of double standards, because when incumbent presidents erode the democratic safeguards in their own country, then ECOWAS tends not really to have worked out exactly how to tackle that. And a case in point is Benin, where in the parliamentary elections last year, government rules excluded the opposition from even taking part in the parliamentary elections. And then in this year's presidential election, presidential candidates were actually arrested, opposition candidates. So there is a double standard, and it's very difficult for ECOWAS to work out how to put that pressure on incumbent governments. That's a really tough issue for the future and the credibility of the bloc.
All right, Paul, thank you very much for speaking to us on Africa Live. Paul Melly, Consulting Fellow at the Africa Program at Chatham House, joining us live there from London. Moving on, Chinese President Xi Jinping has urged the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to help peace efforts in Afghanistan. He was addressing the 21st SCO Leaders Summit via video link on Friday. The meeting was held in Tajikistan's capital, Dushanbe. In a three-point proposal, Xi Jinping called for a smooth transition in Afghanistan and a firm crackdown on terrorist groups. He urged SCO member states to interact with all parties in the country to help form an open and inclusive government and to support the Afghan people, saying China will soon send emergency supplies to the country. Xi Jinping also called for efforts to build a closer SCO community with a shared future. This year marks the organization's 20th anniversary. The SCO is an 8-member regional security organization that includes China, Russia, India, Pakistan, and 4 Central Asian countries. Well, our correspondent Alyosha Milenkovic is in Dushanbe following the meetings. He recaps today's highlights as well as the main agreements so far.
It was, we can say, very long day here in Dushanbe. For the 5 or 6 hours, we had opportunity to listen various delegations and leaders of various delegations here speaking about the security issues, about the food issues, about the COVID-19 issues, about the fighting narcotics or drug trafficking here in the region. And of course, all of them were talking about Afghanistan, because Afghanistan was a key point. It topped all the agenda by everybody. And by the way, maybe some half an hour ago, the combined meeting of the SCO and CSTO has finished here in Dushanbe, and the leader of Tajikistan, who is at the same time the presiding of the SCO, Tajikistan president, is holding a press conference at the building right behind me, where he explains what are the main achievements of this year's SCO. And one of the main achievements, of course, was the enlargement process, because Iran is officially invited to become a full member of the SCO. That was after 13 years of procedure and process, because Iran back in 2008 officially requested the full membership within the SCO.
Ethiopian authorities say they welcome the resumption of the AU-led talks on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Speaking to CGTN, the spokesperson for Ethiopia's foreign ministry, Dina Mufti, said Ethiopia has been seeking an African solution for this African problem. He says the country will head to the talks with Egypt and Sudan in good faith.
The Deputy Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Foreign Minister, His Excellency Demeke, also reiterated and briefed him on Ethiopia's commitment toward these negotiations, and we are out for win-win situations. And he assured him that Ethiopia is out for equitable and rational utilization of the Nile resource, Nile water, and we want the Nile to be the source of cooperation, not the source of confrontation. So Ethiopia is committed to faithfully negotiate, and we want to carry it out.
Meanwhile, the Democratic Republic of Congo's Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Christophe Lutundula, is in Cairo. He'll be meeting Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi to discuss the African Union-led efforts to revive talks to resolve a dispute on Ethiopia's Grand Renaissance Dam. Here is Adel Makhroui with more details.
Hopes that an agreement could be reached on the way forward for the Grand Renaissance Dam have been rekindled this week. On Wednesday, the UN Security Council released a presidential statement urging Egypt, Sudan and Ethiopia to resume talks and reach a legally binding agreement on the filling and operation of the dam. In the same week, Christophe Lutundula, who is the DR Congo's Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, toured the three countries. His last stop on Thursday was in Cairo.
We held sincere, positive and honest talks that will help to find a solution for the differences between these three important countries for the sake of African unity and for the development of our continent. We are all in agreement on the principle that resolving differences goes through the African Union and African solutions. This is very important.
The Security Council is encouraging an African Union-led mediation effort with the participation of any observers the three countries will agree on. It has also encouraged Egypt, Sudan and Ethiopia to reach a final agreement within, quote, a reasonable time frame.
His Excellency has provided a work frame and timings to reach the point of resuming negotiations. But for the negotiation itself, that depends on launching it. I believe that when it's launched, the time frame for it will be determined. The Security Council statement used the time factor twice. Once calling for a rapid resumption of talks, and the other to reach a legally binding agreement in a timely manner.
As the current chair of the African Union, the DR Congo will be supervising the entire negotiations. Earlier this week, President Felix Tshisekedi called Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi to discuss ways through which the talks could resume. Egypt fears the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam would impact its share of the Nile water, which the country says is nearly half the volume of the fresh water it needs. DR Congo aims to bring ministers and technical teams from Egypt, Sudan and Ethiopia as a preliminary step. The aim is to set up the scene and set a foundation for an agreement before the heads of states meet to finalize a deal. Adel Makhroui, CGTN, Cairo.
Somali President Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed has accused Djibouti of illegally detaining his national security advisor Fahad Yassin. This follows what appeared to be a forced stopover of a Turkish Airlines flight in Djibouti bound for Mogadishu, which was allegedly carrying Yassin. The government of Djibouti has, however, denied those accusations. Well, for more on that story, we're now joined by Somali journalist Ali Hussein for more on that. Hussein, differences between the Somali president and his prime minister now appear to have sucked in neighboring Djibouti. Is there any clarity about what happened to the Turkish Airlines flight en route to Mogadishu?
Hi there, thank you for having me. The Turkish flight, the latest information we have is that the Turkish flight that was supposed to come to Mogadishu today went back to Istanbul. after it has been detained in Djibouti for a couple of hours. There are statements from both the Djibouti government and the Somali President Office. The Somali President Office accused the Djibouti government of detaining an official, Fahad Yassin, who was the former NISA chief, who was traveling alongside 40 other passengers in that particular plane. The Djibouti government, as you said, has also rubbished this claim, saying that it will uphold the brotherly relationship between Somalia and between themselves and Somalia. So we don't know which of what happened exactly in the meantime, but what we know is that until now, that plane has returned to Istanbul. The former NISA chief was supposed to attend a conference called by President Farmajo, which was supposed to happen tomorrow. It was a national security conference, and he was expected to deliver a report regarding the disappearance of Ikran Tahlil, a female spy agent who went missing for about 2 months or 3 months ago.
Ali Hussein,
Hi there, you hear me?
Yeah, Ali, thank you very much for speaking to us on Africa Live. Somali journalist Ali Hussein joining us live there from Mogadishu. Well, Somalia's leadership is embroiled in wrangles over who has the right to hire and fire top government officials, something that's threatening the democratic gains the country made over the last few years. President Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed and Prime Minister Mohamed Hussein Roble don't see eye to eye on many issues, but the latest feud between the two leaders has many worried it could have a lasting impact. CGTN's Robert Nagila now reports.
It's not the first time Somalia's president and prime minister have publicly clashed. But the latest row between President Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed and Prime Minister Mohamed Hussein Roble has raised political temperatures and cast doubt on the electoral process scheduled for October. There are fears the row could also affect the fight against militant group Al-Shabaab. Early in the week, the president, in a statement, announced he was suspending the prime minister's executive powers until after the elections slated for October. These included Roble's powers to appoint and fire officials from government. But in a quick rejoinder, the prime minister says the president's actions are unconstitutional and will not be complied with. So how did we get here? The latest clash between the two leaders can be traced back to the disappearance of 25-year-old Ikran Tahlil Farah in June this year. Farah worked for Somalia's National Intelligence Service Agency's Cybersecurity Department. The agency later concluded she had been kidnapped and killed by terror group Al-Shabaab, but the militant group has denied any involvement. And just last week, Prime Minister Roble suspended the intelligence agency's director Fahad Yassin for failing to investigate the case and appointed Bashir Mohammed Jama as interim head of the agency. A day later, President Mohammed termed the Prime Minister's move unconstitutional and appointed Yassin Abdullahi Mohammed to head the agency. Despite calls for a de-escalation, for the moment at least, there appears to be no end in sight to the differences. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Well, it's time for us to take a quick break. Coming up on the program, threat of U.S. sanctions looms large for those perpetrating the conflict in northern Ethiopia. And the crew of China's Shenzhou 12 mission returned to Earth after spending 3 months in space.
I try to not let it affect me, but there are days when it does. I'm a human being, and to see patients in a hospital bed and their family members are not there, there's no one there to hold their hand, that human touch, you know?
I just hope everyone can remember that the situation is not permanent and that everything will get better eventually.
Welcome back. Now, a new executive order signed by U.S. President Joe Biden now authorizes sanctions against those involved in the ongoing conflict in Ethiopia's Tigray region. The northern region of the country has witnessed heavy fighting between government forces and the TPLF. Biden's administration has warned it is prepared to take aggressive action. It is urging stakeholders to take meaningful steps to enter into talks for a negotiated ceasefire. Ethiopian Foreign Ministry tweeted a statement responding to Biden's executive order. It accused the TPLF of using children as, quote, cannon fodder, end quote. Ethiopia's government has designated the group as a terrorist organization. It also claimed the administration and the world was failing to openly condemn the TPLF. Well, for more on this, we're now joined by John Terrett in New York, as well as Girum Chala, who joins us from Addis Ababa. John, I'll begin with you. The United States is setting the stage to impose broad sanctions against those perpetrating the conflict in northern Ethiopia. What more can you tell us about this?
Well, setting the stage is a good way of putting it. I think you should think of this really as a warning shot across the bows of all the combatants in the region. It is, if you like, a diplomatic bashing of heads together. You know, when you come across a group of people who simply won't see sense and you want to give them a clip round the ear, well, that is essentially what the White House is doing with today's announcement in the form of an executive order signed by the President Joe Biden. And you have to remember, this conflict began as a very local conflict about the issue of local control. And I think the White House thinks that Ethiopia threw absolutely everything it has at the conflict. The rebels flew to the hills, and now we have this situation which is coming up for a year old now. President Biden, it is said, is appalled at daily reports of murder and rape from this conflict. And I think it is a threat of sanctions, therefore, if there are no peace moves from either side or any of the four sides within the next couple of weeks. You have to remember the United States is a major ally of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a major ally of the United States in the war on terror. And also the United States is the biggest donor of aid funds to Ethiopia. So what has happened today here in Washington is that the United States Treasury, right next door to the White House, and the State Department down in Foggy Bottom have effectively been empowered to look at all of that relationship with Ethiopia and decide what they might do in the future. As we've said, these sanctions are a threat. They are on hold. The White House is looking for some kind of peace movement from one, if not all, of the sides.
And Girum, coming to you in Addis Ababa, has there then been a response from Ethiopian authorities, and should we expect a different reaction from this particular threat of external sanctions?
Different Ethiopian authorities and people on the streets of Addis Ababa we tried to speak to earlier today say that they are unhappy and dissatisfied with the repeated statements, negative statements, if you like, Mahia, by the United States about the situation in the northern part of Ethiopia. You should understand also that these statements are not helping the conflict in the north. Many are saying that it's also escalating as TPLF is getting confidence from the statements coming out bashing the Ethiopian government. Now, this is according to the authorities. But the most important statement that came out and we have just received is from the Ethiopian Prime Minister himself. He wrote an open letter for President Joe Biden himself, saying that the United States lacks a deep understanding of the context of the situation on the ground here in Ethiopia, and also tries to perhaps compare and contrast a federal government elected by the people and a rebel group which is operating in the north. This is according to the statement. Mahia, I would like to read you a few points before I conclude your question. It says the Prime Minister wrote for President Joe Biden, says that Ethiopia will not succumb to the consequences of pressure engineered by disgruntled individuals for whom consolidating power is more important than the well-being of millions. Our identity as Ethiopians, our identity as Africans will not let this come to pass. This is what the Prime Minister in general terms has explained of the situation and his unhappiness over the United States proposal to slam more sanctions on Ethiopia.
Right, and John Turrett, coming back to you in New York, why is the U.S. then convinced that a threat of sanctions is going to lead to a negotiated ceasefire in the northern Ethiopia conflict?
Well, I'm not sure that they are convinced. I think that's the problem. I think that's probably why the delay, why the sanctions haven't been imposed with immediate effect. Of course, there's nothing yet, not on any entity in the region, not on any individual in the region. I think that the White House has been told that there is no answer to this conflict. It cannot be resolved. It's either more war or some kind of negotiated settlement. And I do think that they see a glimmer of hope. And the reason for that is we do often see, particularly with rebel organizations, it's a split within them, that very often we get to the point where one side begins to move towards some kind of negotiated settlement. The US, of course, remember, has already applied some sanctions. Earlier this year, in fact in May I think it was, they applied visa restrictions to some individuals concerned with the fighting, and I think there might have been some aid restrictions as well, but nothing like there will be if this isn't sorted out. The White House today is saying it's very keen not to hurt the ordinary people of Eritrea or Ethiopia, and I think one thing, a sign that they would like to see, is that medical supplies and food supplies, emergency aid, starts to get through, because that's the big problem at the moment. It's generally not getting through to the people who need it. So that would be food and medicines, and also crucially in this era of COVID, PPE as well.
And finally, Girum, what options then is Ethiopia considering in order to decisively conclude the conflict with the TPLF?
Well, yesterday we have attended a press conference by Press Secretary of the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. The Press Secretary Belene Siyum told us that Ethiopia wants to see the end of this conflict peacefully. But one thing that they see as a solution is a national dialogue. That national dialogue is under preparation at the moment, and that's according to the press statement itself that we have received. This national dialogue is expected to enable Ethiopians to come together, discuss their matters without the interference of others, so that they can find the solution for the problem that is pertaining in the country at the moment. You understand that the continuation of the conflict is affecting Ethiopia more than any other country in the world, and every day that counts is also bringing more humanitarian services needing people in the northern part of the country. As you know, conflict is expanding to Amhara and Afar regional states, and all that's already adding up a fuel to the existing problem at the moment. So Ethiopian authorities say that there is a peaceful solution that needs to come to the table as soon as possible, and they call it a national dialogue. And we should wait and see, Mahia, if that is going to help Ethiopia resolve its own troubles using its own resource.
Right. Thank you very much for your insights there, Girum. John Turrett in New York, and Girum Chala joining us live there from Addis Ababa. Well, staying with that story, Ethiopia's military is calling on young people and militias fighting for the Tigray People's Liberation Front to surrender peacefully. The Ethiopian military says those who turn themselves in will be taken care of. The conflict in the country's north between government troops and forces loyal to the TPLF has been raging for months. CGTN's Coletta Wanjohi reports from Addis Ababa.
Ethiopian National Defense Forces says the army will accept those who surrender from the Tigray People's Liberation Front, treat them if they are injured, and facilitate a peaceful life with their families. The government says this is a noble call.
I think it's important that this message is received within the spirit of solidarity, that is received within the spirit of understanding that the Tigray region cannot sustain loss of an entire generation of youth, as is being perpetrated by the TPLF as well.
Fighting in the north has now spilled over to the Amhara and Afar regions. The UN says in these two areas alone, 1.7 million people are now food insecure. A peaceful resolution to the fighting is yet to be agreed on. Both sides are not ready for talks yet. The government has reiterated that it will not negotiate with terrorists. TPLF, on the other hand, has given conditions that it says the government must meet if it is to have any peace talks. In the meantime, the humanitarian crisis in the region is getting worse. The United Nations World Food Programme says about 7 million people in the region need its support. WFP says it needs about $426 million to expand its emergency food assistance program in Ethiopia over the next 6 months. And the government is calling for help internally.
Apart from the donor fatigue, I mean, Ethiopians are also supporting their fellow brothers and sisters, and this call is actually also something that is being put to Ethiopians throughout the country and also in the diaspora to keep supporting, because this aspect of supporting each other is something that's inherent to our culture and our social fabric, and this is something that we still call upon.
Calls for mediation fronted by the United Nations, African Union and individual countries have not been successful so far. The government says that after a new administration is formed in October, a national dialogue mechanism is expected to lead to peace and reconciliation in the north. Coletta Njohi, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Now, the crew members of China's Shenzhou 12 mission have arrived in Beijing hours after returning to Earth. They worked on China's Tiangong space station for 3 months. Nie Haisheng, Liu Boming and Tang Hongbo were warmly welcomed at the Shijiao military airport in the northwest of Beijing. All of them are in good shape, but they were lifted off the plane on soft chairs to prevent skeletal injury. After 3 months of weightlessness, earlier today they were safely picked up from the Shenzhou 12 re-entry capsule after it touched down in Dongfeng in northern China's Inner Mongolia region. The Shenzhou 12 crew helped build China's first space station, the Tiangong, and carried out China's most challenging series of extravehicular activities. They also set a new record for China's space program for their length of stay in space. Now, after the successful return of the Shenzhou 12 spacecraft, what is next for China's space exploration? The China Manned Space Engineering Office says the nation is preparing to launch a Tianzhou 3 cargo spacecraft later this month, carried by a Long March 7 rocket. This cargo mission will carry supplies, equipment and propellant to the Tianhe Space Station core module to prepare for the arrival of the Shenzhou 13, which is expected to launch in October this year. The Shenzhou 13 mission will send 3 astronauts into space for 6 months, double the time of the Shenzhou 12 mission. The mission will further strengthen the function of China's space station. The astronauts will once again conduct experiments, technology verification, Earth imagery, and extravehicular activities. China's space station is set to become the only active station in orbit after the International Space Station retires in 2024. Russia has announced that it may leave the ISS in 2025 and build its own space station by 2030. And that's all we have for you on Africa Live. Do join us for more in coming bulletins. Thank you for watching.